Welcome to Sniblet number 9. Over the past 2 weeks, we have talked about the mechanics of communication. James 1:19 helps us understand the skills of listening and expressing. Last week when we left you, we basically said we want to develop the idea of how do we share our heart with one another. So, those 2 skills lay a foundation for vulnerability. But let's push it down to a deeper level. How do we express and listen at a heart level? Let me prime the pump by sharing a quote. Julie and I heard this quote years ago. It says, "The quickest way to someone's heart is through their wounds." The quickest way to someone's heart is through their wounds. If that's true, the question becomes, how do we incorporate that into connecting at a deeper level?
Wow. I think all of us, if we're honest with ourselves, we live our day-to-day lives today and respond to things through the lens of these pains or wounds that we've had individually in our lives, many of which have happened prior to us getting married. For instance, if you had an alcoholic parent or a father or mother who abandoned you, left the scene, the loss of a best friend in grade school, whether through a move or horribly through a death. Anything like that, a premature death of a loved one in your family, divorced parents, physical abuse, sexual abuse. Maybe some of you in your early teen years fell in love with someone who did not fall in love with you.
Right.
All of these wounds, we each respond in ways and patterns that ultimately keep us moving forward. Some of those are good, some of those are bad, but they definitely have imprinted us in how we relate in our relationships going forward.
Yeah. All of us have a degree of pain that has been inflicted on us or self-inflicted.
Right.
So is it safe to say that in our communication, if we don't understand the wounds that each other have experienced, we won't ever get to the place in communication that we long for?
Yeah, definitely. Or even higher calling than that is that the level that God designed us for or actually intended for us. You think about early in scriptures in Genesis, it tells us that we are made in the image of God. And I think one truth of that, one aspect of that, I think it's a truth I won't ever fully understand, but one aspect of it is that as human beings, he gives us the ability to connect at this spiritual and soul kind of deep level that he does not allow to occur with all other living things.
Right.
And so I think that's one reflection of what it means to be made in the image of God, although there's lots more.
Yeah.
We want to be able to connect at that level because he designed us to be able to do that and benefit from that.
So practically, how do we get there?
Yeah, that's the key.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of us know that, but the process of seeing that happen in our lives is much more difficult. I think as Dan and I have processed this and talked through it, we've thought that the most helpful thing could be to possibly look back on your life in the years prior to you leaving home and break it down into possibly 3 categories, like probably your childhood, early teen years, and then maybe your young adult years. And then once you've done that, take a minute and think back on that phrase that we used the last time we were together. I feel when you fact. And I want you to think of an event that has marked you in some way from each of those periods of time, a child, teen, and a young adult. And I want you to think about, when this happened to me, I felt such and such.
This way. Yeah. So give us an example from your childhood.
Yeah. I think I've got lots I could draw from. We all do. But I think one that we've told one another early on that has influenced us going forward is when I was a little girl, I lived in Kansas, and my grandparents one set of my grandparents lived in Indiana, and my grandfather was a farmer, a solo farmer of a large plot of land, and he was a very big, gruff, aggressive, very hardcore man. And I remember wanting so bad to be around him and yet being really also very much afraid of him. And so there was this one, I was probably 8 years old, and there was this one Saturday that my family had gone to visit for the week, and he had invited my brother and I to go with him on a tractor ride that Saturday, and that was a really big deal. And on that day, he gave a lot of really clear instructions, and I remember thinking really hard, trying to keep it all straight. Like, don't walk here because it's muddy, and don't step here, and watch this over here. And all of a sudden, in the midst of all that, I just remember I stepped ankle deep into just a foot full of mud.
You did what he told you not to do.
Exactly. And my grandfather responded in such a shame-bearing kind of way, and I felt so embarrassed. I felt stupid. I felt foolish because he had specifically said, don't step here, and I did it anyway. And I think as a result of, if I really pondered that story, I think it set in motion in me a real tentativeness and kind of a non-risk-taking style in me that I carried into my young girl, early teenage years that I think really had an impact on me because
Sure.
I was so afraid of ever feeling like that again.
Yeah, and I remember when you shared that with me, feeling compassion for you
Yeah.
as a little girl, because those events, they go with us.
Right.
And so we've even adopted that
Yeah.
language not in a make fun of you sort of way, but in a
Right.
way of like, because as an adult, you can figuratively, oh, I stepped in the mud.
Right.
And we'll even call it that when you've been in a situation where,
Right.
we
I'll come
sense
in
that-
and have to explain to Dan that I felt super embarrassed or ashamed of what I said or did or
or somebody
whatever.
made you feel,
Yeah.
tried to make you feel, and I said, you're that little girl that stepped in the mud.
Yeah. And that says to me that Dan knows exactly what I'm feeling in that moment. And we're able to do that as a tool in our adult life because we took the time to share what that felt like as a young
Right.
girl to walk through that.
Right.
Tell them about, I think another thing that we did, Dan did, when you hear the story, you'll understand that I think Dan did as a result of not only that story with my grandfather, but others that he has like
Yeah.
that as well. We all do.
All of us probably have grandfather stories or
Some-
some sort of figurative story like that,
Right.
that impacted us, that marked us, that made us tentative, that hurt. And I thought those painful stories ought to impact our parenting.
Right.
And so I always remember the feeling of any child, when they knock over a glass of juice or a glass of milk, they feel bad. And then
They look around to see how everybody's
adults
gonna
have a
respond.
tendency to be disgusted. So we had a policy when the kids were little, if they knocked a glass over, it was just like I would just kind of reflexively knock my glass over. Oh darn, look what happened. Because I didn't want them
To feel that way.
to feel bad and to have a spilled glass of milk
Yeah.
mark them for the rest of their life.
This is where the different qualities that you each bring into parenting are so important. Because I never was able to be the one that knocked over the glass because I hated to clean up the
There were
mess.
times you'd even look at me and go,
Like, oh, please
don't
don't."
knock over the glass.
But Dan always would, and looking back, what does it matter that we cleaned up a bunch of messy tables? Because I think our kids understood it was never that big of a deal to
Yeah.
us. They were not going to have to feel embarrassed about that.
So here's the application.
Yeah.
Think of those events that Julie described. Think of those periods in time where your childhood, teenage years, young adult. Think of those windows of time where maybe you experienced some hurt.
Yeah.
And then communicate those to one another.
Go out to dinner. Take some time. Make it a priority.
So we're talking about expressing heart connection.
Right.
Next week, we'll talk about listening and that role in listening when somebody shares those wounds.
Yeah.
So we'll see you next week.